a lifelong learning session on Pirkei Avot, the first of three. And it's my pleasure to say that in this room, Joe Rosenstein normally needs no introduction. His books are used every time that the Dominion meets and has for the last quarter century. One piece of housekeeping: speaking in the room, speak up, because they only have one microphone. And I'd like Sharon Diamondstein on behalf of the religious school.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning. We are told that the world stands on three things: on Torah, on Chesed, and on Avodah, on sacred work. Not in that order, actually. You will be exploring the correct order momentarily. However, as you're learning these Mishnayot, our students are going to be exploring the same lessons as well. They will be learning, not in this, because there are about 150 of them, but they will be learning the same things that we're learning today, which is a really nice way to bridge this gap and show how important these lessons really are as we proceed. So thank you, Joe, for being here, and enjoy the learning, and so check in on the learning going on that side.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So Neil, I should begin?
Yeah,
Okay,
people are still coming in on Zoom.
so let me wait. Till Arnie comes back. Yeah, okay. Just a minute then.
The system has some things.
Okay. Are we waiting for anybody now? Okay.
But he went out, I'll go ahead and stop.
I'll wait for you
Oh,
then.
no, period.
Good.
No, that's not.
Okay. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thank you to the center and to Neil Litt for inviting me to do 3 sessions on Pirkei. And thank you all for coming to this morning's presentation, whether you came in person or whether you're joining us on Zoom. So I'm going to start by putting Pirkei Avot in. Avot is a small section which was compiled in about the year 200 of the Common Era, just about 1800 years ago, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, based on initial work done by Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, and others in previous generations. The Mishnah has, as we sing Echad Mi Yodea, who knows one. When we get to who knows 6, the answer is 6 are. So there are 6 books of the Mishnah. These 6 books are divided into 5 parts, of which Avot is one of them. So it really is a very small portion of the Mishnah. It's actually a shorter one than most of the others, so it's much shorter than what I described. The focus of the Mishnah as a whole is on halacha, regulations for the new version of Judaism that was created by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai followers after the destruction of the temple in the year 7. Avot is the only portion of the Mishnah that has no halacha, no rules. Instead, ethical teachings, advice to Torah scholars and would-be Torah scholars, and aphorisms addressed to the general population. Cited in Avot span 500 years, from about 300 before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era. There are 5 chapters in Avot containing the teachings of about 70 sages, presented approximately in chronological order, not strictly in chronological order, approximately. The later sages had to reconstruct from memory what the earlier sages had said, since they couldn't interview them, they couldn't check their websites, and their teachings were likely not written down. Everything was passed on orally. About 1,000 years ago, the practice originated of studying one chapter of Avot on each Shabbat between Pesach and Shavuot. It turns out that Shabbat occurs exactly 6 times between Pesach and Shavuot. But Avot has only 5 chapters, so a 6th chapter was added to Avot. And perhaps when that happened, the resulting collection was called Pirkei Avot. Originally, it was called Avot. In the Mishnah itself, it was called Avot. What is the appeal of Pirkei Avot? Why has this practice of reading it every year proved to be enduring? Why has this part of the Mishnah captured the attention and the loyalty of the Jewish people? Certainly, the focus of most Jews has been on the ethical teachings of Pirkei Avot, and only to a lesser extent on the other teachings. From the issues discussed and the advancement in the ethical teachings, we learn that human nature has not changed all that much over the past 2,000 years. We still have to deal with such issues as anger, respect, gratitude, humility, desires, and so on. And the advice given in Pirkei Avot is, for the most part, very wise. The teachers in Pirkei Avot were wise men whose wisdom has endured for 2 millennia. The third session of these 3 sessions will focus on the ethical teachings of Pirkei Avot, although we'll study some of the ethical teachings today as well. What is that these sages lived in terrible times. The Holy Temple and the Holy City of Jerusalem had been destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, and the Holocaust that took place 60 years later was second only to the Holocaust of our time. Many of us think of the Holocaust every day, although it happened 75 years ago. They wept every day over their destruction. Yet the post-traumatic stress that they must have experienced is absent from Pirkei Avot. Like the Mishnah as a whole, Pirkei Avot is upbeat and forward-looking, part of the conscious effort to build a new version of Judaism to replace the one that was destroyed. Build a new version of Judaism that would last of years. I remember as a youngster studying that afternoon in the spring with my Rebbe on his little porch. We went through Pirkei Avot, one Mishnah after another, as it is commonly presented in common time. So in an hour or two on a Shabbat afternoon, we could study all Pirkei Avot. So the title of my book, and here I'll hold it up, is, let's see, I don't know if you can all see it, but you can see it from a distance. It's called reflections on Pirkei Avot, not just what my Rebbe taught me. And I will soon discuss some of the ways in which this book goes beyond presenting only a brief discussion of each individual Mishnah, one Mishnah at a time. I should first say that my Rebbe, whose name was Rebbe Gedalia Cohen, Olav HaShalom, must have taught me well, because I internalized many of the teachings of Pirkei Avot. For example, the first time I went to Israel in the 1960s, I had a discussion on a train with a rabbi who me for my hippie-like appearance. Things haven't changed very much. I responded, Alti kan ela b'masha yeshbo. Don't focus on the bottle, but on what's inside it. A comment by the editor of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, telling us not to be distracted by. I'm sure that he was very surprised that this hippie could quote Pirkei Avot. I also learned that Ein Habayishan Lo Made. One who is embarrassed to ask questions cannot really learn. So I learned from Pirkei Avot that I should always ask questions. What does this mean? Why is this so? How do you justify this claim? Asking such questions has been fundamental in my approach to Judaism and also to mathematics. And when an Orthodox colleague of mine gleefully informed me many years ago that the then president of Egypt, I said to myself, isn't he aware in Pirkei Avot, B'nefol oyevacha al tismach, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. Although I learned to ask questions from Pirkei Avot, one kind of question that my Rebbe did not discuss with me was, why would Shmuel HaKatan that one should not rejoice at the fall of one's enemies? Where did that come from? My sense is that such a warning comes about because people were behaving in exactly the way that was being described and that was being forbidden in a sense. So, Rabbi Shmuel Katan's cautionary remark, which is on the handout number 10, if you want to look, is actually a quote from Proverbs. Just word for word from Proverbs, no comment. So he must have felt some urgency in repeating this biblical verse. So I asked myself, I'm supposed to ask questions, what was the urgency? Why statement? What could the people have been rejoicing about in the years following the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem? Well, it turns out that 9 years later, something extraordinary happened. Anybody know? The year 79. 79 was the year when Vesuvius erupted and destroyed the city, the great Roman city of Pompeii. Perhaps there was great rejoicing about that. Perhaps people may have joyfully proclaimed, you destroyed our city, God destroyed yours. Is that what actually happened? Was Shmuel HaKatan discouraging the glee of some of his comrades? I don't know that that's what did happen. There are many other teachings where the context may be relevant. My Rebbe didn't discuss the context of the teachings, probably because his Rebbe didn't discuss the context of the teachings either. A lot of context was happening during those 500 years of Avot, from 300 before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era. Life under Persian rule, then under Greek rule, then under Roman rule. There were conflicts between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, between the schools of Hillel and of course the rise of Christianity. There were the rebellions of the Maccabees, that was successful, and the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, which was dramatically unsuccessful. As I mentioned before, the greatest annihilation of Jews before the Holocaust took place in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Yet to this very not commemorated in any way. We don't mention hate in the same company as Haman Hitler. None of these historical happenings are mentioned in Pirkei Avot, nor perhaps in the entire Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers and their descendants were optimistically focused on building a new Judaism and didn't want to be distracted by current events. So in my book, I try to present, at least to some extent, the historical context of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. I also try in my book to present the context in which I was, the epidemic with which we were all coping, and the political circumstances as well. Very often, the teachings that I was writing about were relevant to the circumstances of the day. So my discussion of Pirkei Avot also serves as a personal memoir of the 2.5 or so years in which it was written. Indeed, I include in my book comments about how many of the teachings of Pirkei Avot have been meaningful to me throughout my life. That is, I personalized the teaching. Some of my advisors urged me COVID to ensure that my book would be, quote. But I also saw my book as a memoir, so I left them in. Let me give you 2 examples. Number 7 on the sheet, if you have it with you, is a teaching of Rabbi Tarfon. It said, in paraphrase, it's not your responsibility to finish the task, but that cannot be used as an excuse for abandoning the task altogether. That quote has been, that teaching has been quoted several times in the political arena in recent years, including by the recent winner of the Pennsylvania governorship election. We are often facing huge challenges like global warming and its effects on our climate, and it is easy to say, this task is too big. Why should I bother working on it? I can never accomplish it. Rabbi Tar, not to give up. We may not accomplish all of our goals, but we should nevertheless persevere. I would often ask myself, would I live long enough to finish this book? I was then almost 80 years old. Now I'm almost 82. And I was vulnerable to getting COVID, probably I still am. Thousands and thousands of people my age were dying. Would I live long enough to finish this book? Rabbi Tarfon told me to persist, to keep working on it. So I continued, and I was able to at least finish a book. A second example, while writing this book, I became frustrated that my leg was not healing properly. And I responded by converting a teaching in Pirkei Avot into a mantra. This is also on your sheet, number 9, part C. Ezahu Ashir, who is wealthy? And he answered, Hasameach b'chalko, the person who is satisfied with what he has. I repeated to myself over and over, Sameach b'chalko, Sameach b'chalko. A mantra, don't focus on what's not working. Focus instead on all of your many blessings and be grateful for them. Reciting Sameach b'chalko really eased my frustration. So at this point, what I'd like to do is stop my presentation and give you a chance to read about and think about and discuss the first 3 teachings on the handout. Now, I don't know whether people on Zoom have printed up a copy of the handout. I see at least one person did. Okay, so we're going to break you up into 2 groups on Zoom and maybe 3 groups here, and have you read first 3 Mishnayot here, or these are actually translations of an abbreviated version of the Mishnayot. So we'll discuss the first 3 teachings for about, let's say, give 4 minutes to each teaching, so it'll be 12 minutes altogether. And then we'll come back and discuss, please. Okay. So we could have gone longer with this discussion, obviously, but we need to continue. So let me first ask if anyone has any questions about or comments about the first Mishnah, number 1 here, which is actually not the first Mishnah, it's the second Mishnah, but nevertheless, it's the first Mishnah on the sheet. Any comments about that or questions? Yes.
For the question we were sort of raising was timing. When Shimon said the temple was reconstructed or being reconstructed, but when, if I'm right,
Yeah.
almost, but when this was all redacted by Yehuda Nasi, the temple didn't exist anymore.
Yes. So that's certainly correct. Shimon was writing, he lived about the year 300 before the Common Era. And the temple existed then, and probably was flourishing then. And you're right that when the Mishnah was being redacted, the temple no longer existed. Yet this was kept in the Mishnah as is, as if the temple did exist. Yes, that's correct. Other comments about number 1?
I don't know. Can it be heard?
Yes,
Surely,
go ahead.
surely they expected that the temple would be rebuilt.
Yes, so it is possible that they expected the temple would be rebuilt. They were no longer counting on that. So, for example, in Pirkei Avot, this was written in around. This was finalized in around the year 200. Only 3 generations after the temple, or 4 generations. There's not one mention in Pirkei Avot of the temple being rebuilt. As I said before, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the person who started the effort to reconstruct Judaism, was looking forward only. I should mention who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was. He was, before the temple was destroyed, he was the vice chair of the Sanhedrin, and he tried to convince people not to fight the Romans. But the zealots in his time, like zealots we have today, are insisting on getting everything, and so they forced a fight with the Romans. But Yochanan ben Zakkai, beforehand, in the year 68 or 69, he was convinced that in order for Judaism to survive, he would have to do something else. He was smuggled outside of Jerusalem, and he went to Vespasian, who was the Roman general at the time, and he addressed him as Emperor Vespasian. And Vespasian said, "I'm not the emperor, I'm just a general." And he said, "But you will be the emperor very soon." And he was right. He became the emperor that. And he asked Vespasian if he would allow him to establish an academy at Yavne, which is, 40 miles outside of Jerusalem. And he did. And that's where he rebuilt Judaism. So, so they were not as focused on reconstructing the temple as we might think. They believed it would happen, but that wasn't their focus, I don't think. At least we don't see it in Pirkei Avot, which is striking. So this is leads to a number of interesting questions. One is, I should also mention that how do we know when Shimon lived? And it says he was one of the last members of the Great Assembly. The Great Assembly is an unknown body. It's not mentioned in any of the other texts. It's not mentioned in Josephus, who wrote the history, and so on. It's not mentioned anywhere. But apparently what happened was that after the first temple was destroyed in the 6th century Common Era, shortly after that, the Babylonian Empire was defeated by Cyrus, who created the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire, Cyrus's perspective, which lasted as long as the Persian Empire did, was that the people that he captured, he allowed them general autonomy. They had to obviously pay a tribute to the empire, but they had autonomy. So apparently, the Great Assembly was the body which which sort of ran the Jewish community. We don't know anything about it, things about it, but not very much. We don't see its name anywhere else. What happened to it? Well, we know what happened to it. Alexander the Great happened to it. In the year 332, Alexander the Great marched across to the east, conquered the Persian Empire, and became a Greek empire. And apparently, they abolished this great assembly because they did not want the Jews to have the independence which they had under the Persian Empire. And so when it says that Shimon the Righteous was one of the last members of the Great Assembly, we can take that pretty literally, that he was among the people in the Great Assembly. The Great Assembly might well have been started by Ezra and Nehemiah when they came from Babylonia to Israel in the early part of the 5th century BCE. So we know roughly when Shimon the Righteous lived, and it's extraordinary, as I heard this group mentioning, that the practice of loving kindness is on the same level for Shimon as the temple service and the practice of the practice of acts of loving kindness is in the same category as that. Now, I visualize this as a three-legged stool. The world stands on three things: one Torah, one Avodah, one Milut Chasadim. What happened when the temple was destroyed? That meant that one of the three legs of this was cut away. How could we survive? Perspective, we couldn't. But it was the wisdom, say genius, of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers that they figured out how to make a new version of Judaism that survived. So, for example, one of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Yeshua ben Hananiah, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit the ruins of Jerusalem, and Yeshua ben Hananiah started weeping. He says, "How will our sins be forgiven? How will this happen? How will that happen?" And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Don't worry, we have acts of loving kindness. Acts of loving kindness will replace temple sacrifice, as was said by one of the prophets." So this Mishnah is a very important Mishnah because it not only in terms of what he said, but what they did with this Mishnah subsequently. Okay, let's turn to number 2, which is the Mishnah directly after this one. It was very surprising. I looked, Antigonos obviously has a Greek name, so he's already in the Greek period. But I looked up Antigonos' name on Wikipedia, and it said that he flourished at the beginning of the 3rd century before the Common Era. And I said to myself, he flourished? I mean, people don't flourish. Organizations flourish. Countries flourish. So I said, where did Wikipedia get a phrase like he flourished? Well, it turns out I found out where he got it from in the early part of the 20th century, between 1905. The Jewish Encyclopedia was put together, including a number of people who we recognize now, including Solomon Schechter was one of the writers. And the article that was written for the Jewish Encyclopedia in 1902 about Antigonos used the term he flourished in the 3rd century, beginning part of the 3rd century, a word that we would never, but I found the source of it. Anyways, what do you have to say about this? Any comments? Yes.
That was discussed a lot.
Yes.
The idea of to be a servant who serves the master you know, do not expect reward, and what does that mean? And does it mean intention, or does it mean that you're just doing something regardless of the reason? We also discussed, or I was coming up with the idea of that work, that you should work without the idea of a reward, and that seemed a little strange. But then
Right.
also the idea of like, you should, that this is more not about work, but like doing acts of kindness, and if you see it, and maybe that the reward is internal, or the concept of maybe this person who flourished could have you know, without the expectation of a reward, but tranquility, something along the line of essence.
Right, so you feel something is missing there.
A little bit, just the idea of like, if we're talking about work, and that's the example he's giving, you know, not even just work, it's a servant to a master.
Right.
You know, the reward of either, it's hard to not put it in the context of where we are now of compensation, of healthcare, of all the
Right.
other to a job, of this,
Right.
you know, the idea of like, well, you're doing it because
Right,
you're a good person. So you should
Right.
just sort of do it. I don't know if that was the.
okay. Yes,
One thing I thought of, we talked about this a lot, and we were first struggling with the idea of servants in today's world. Servants and slavery didn't quite make sense. But if you think of and all the things that people do, hopefully do for each other without expectation of a reward. The nice things we do, we'll hold the door open for someone, you don't expect a reward for that. And that's probably a better way than if there was some compensation for every nice thing you did for somebody.
right. Okay, so part of the problem that both of you are having with this Mishnah is that the words in the translation here are not good. So the Hebrew word for master here is Rav. Okay, so it's not referring to your relationship to an employer, and the word reward makes it sound like, you know, it's something you're paid. So this is above what you would be paid for doing what you do. So the Hebrew word there is paras, and there's a word for reward for work is sachar, which we're going to talk more about next class. But here it's very clear that this has always been understood for a person to God. And Antigonos is saying that in doing the right thing, according to what Judaism teaches, you shouldn't be worried about whether you will get a reward or not. Okay. So, and for me, this is how I understood it as a kid. I said to myself, why am I doing all these things? Observing various religious practices, doing chesed kinds of things. I should not be concerned about being rewarded for them in the future. And at that time, when I was young, the future promise was Olam Haba, the world to come. So I shouldn't be doing these things expecting to get rewards in Olam Haba or expecting to get rewards in either. I should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. And so that is how Antigonos has been understood throughout the ages. And we're going to talk more about rewards and punishments next time again. But so Antigonos' statement basically has been understood as saying that, as describing the relationship between a person and God, and saying that you should not be doing things because God is promising you all sorts of things. You should not be building buildings and have them named after you. You should not be doing good deeds because you're going to get recompense for them afterwards. You should just be doing them because they're the right thing to do, as it were. Okay, so that's what he's really been talking about here. So the question is, how do I translate Rav? Because master makes it sound like, as you pointed out, serving the master sounds like maybe not a slavery situation, but certainly a situation where there's an employer relationship, which is not intended here. Clearly, the word rob doesn't mean that, but I don't know how to translate that otherwise. Maybe I should just say who serve God with expectation of receiving the word. Okay, any other comments about this one?
Can I just ask you?
Yes.
Eros was the word for river. Could you talk just a little more about what that means?
It's not clear what it's not clear what that means. It would be used. It would be used now as like a bonus.
Oh,
What it then we don't know. I mean, it's a fascinating question just throughout, because words change their meanings over time, and so we're trying to guess what he meant by it and express it in terms that are relevant to us, and that's sort of hard to do. Okay, let's look at the third one here, which is a statement of Hillel, which you're probably all familiar with because it also is frequently quoted. Hillel says, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And when I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, then when?" So did anyone have any comments about that? Anyone on the Zoom there? Anyone have any comments about that?
I think he's talking about the dynamic balance of caring about those around you. And it's not always a 50-50. I think there's a balance that's necessary to have for health. And if not now, when having good intentions is very nice, but you got to put it into practice. You got to do it.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Yes.
So before you explained the meaning of point two, I thought point three really connecting to point two in the sense that if you only for yourself,
Yes.
you're not for the person. And that's how I read it.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay. Now, so unlike the first two, well, I shouldn't say that, but number three is clearly an ethical principle. Now, but if you have an ethical principle, it should tell you what you should do. It should be what's the word in English? It should have no, I have it written down somewhere. More directive, exactly. You want it to be a more directive statement which says, do this. So nowadays, people will take the first thing to mean that you should be an advocate for yourself. If you're not, then no one will be for you. And that's taken both with respect to individuals and with respect to the Jewish people. That we often use this phrase to say, we're doing this because no one else is going to do this for us. So we have to act on our own. And we do that individually or in a group. So we might translate, if we wanted to make a more directive statement, what we might do is translate part of Hillel's statement as be an advocate for yourself. Okay. However, what's very interesting is that because the language is ambiguous in this Mishnah, as in other Mishnayot, other people have different interpretations of this. For example, Maimonides' interpretation of this Mishnah is that your goal in life is to become which means you have to train yourself to be an ethical person. You can't just simply, I'm going to be an ethical person. It's going to happen overnight. You have to train yourself. So, for example, one extreme example that Maimonides gives is this. He says, although it may be better for the donee to receive 1,000 dinar, dinar is the language, is the currency that he was talking about. For the donor, it's better to give 1,000 people 1 dinar each, because that gets you habituated to giving tzedakah. That you give one gift, you say, well, I'm done for the year or for my lifetime. But if you give every day, then it becomes a practice that you have. So Maimonides felt that the important part of the goal of life was to become an ethical person so that you would be able to become closer to God. So he translated this as saying, you're the only person who can grow ethically, grow spiritually. So you have to be the one to do that. No one else can do it for you. Other come the same statement by Hillel and used it with respect to education. You have responsibility for your education. No one else can do it for you. Okay, so in many Mishnayot in Avot, there's more than one interpretation, and depending on which interpretation you use, you can different possible ethical conclusions. This one, as I said, the 3 possible ethical conclusions. One is to be an advocate for yourself, and the other is take responsibility for your ethical development, and the third is take responsibility for your education. So how would Maimonides have translated as the second one? The second part of Hillel's statement, you can't do it alone. You can't become an ethical person as a hermit. It's very easy to be a good person if you don't have to deal with other people. But if you're going to be dealing with other people, then it's really a challenge to be an ethical person. So Maimonides made it very clear that he did not mean that you should go off and be an ethical person all by yourself. So let me, any other comments on this? I see now a name, Tobias Robeson, who I think I went to college with years ago. I didn't recognize him, but yes.
Yes, indeed. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Same here.
I wouldn't have recognized you, and you probably wouldn't have recognized me in the streets either.
Possibly not.
Okay. So in my book, in addition to discussing each Mishnah individually, I refer on the same page to all of the Mishnahs that address the same topic. And beyond that, I have included in the book 7 what I call theme chapters that collect together and discuss all the Mishnayot that deal with 7 specific themes. So let me introduce those theme chapters by mentioning them, and then describing the 3 major developments in the Jewish religion that took place during the Mishnaic period. These 3 developments will be the focus of our session in 2 weeks. But I need to tell you what they are now because I'm describing the book. First of all, one of the 3 developments was the concept of the oral Torah. The second was the adoption of a belief in Olam Haba, the world to come. And the third was the rise of rabbinic scholarship. Many Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot address each of these developments, but usually they are not considered side by side. They're considered separately, whatever they can arise. That is, when we study Pirkei Avot, the way we usually do, Mishnah by Mishnah in order, we don't look at the text broadly. We don't get to see the big picture. So the first theme chapter deals with the oral Torah. The first chapter of Pirkei Avot explicitly claims that all practices of Judaism, the written Torah, scroll that we use to this day, communicated orally to Moses by God at Sinai and ages of one generation to the next without change over the 1,000 years from Moses to Hillel. Torah is examined in the first theme chapter. The second theme chapter deals with all references to Olam Haba, the world to come, and observes that a substantial change occurs between Hillel's first mention of Olam Haba and the compilation of the year. The third theme chapter, rewards, which are mentioned many times in Pirkei Avot, either implicitly or explicitly, not generally linked to Olam Haba. Surprising, but it also is surprising that rewards are mentioned so frequently, since in the third Mishnah of Avot, which we just read, number 2 on today's handout, the sage Antigonosus states very explicitly, do not be like servants who serve the master with the expectation of receiving awards. So it appears that this sage advice by Antigonos for a person's God was rejected. Pirkei Avot, one Mishnah at a time, you might not notice that rewards are mentioned 15 times. And that about the same number of Mishnayot deal with punishments. So Antigonos's teaching was not the last word on the subject. The fourth theme chapter of my book addresses the importance of studying Torah. And the fifth theme chapter deals with balancing the study of Torah with earning a living and with doing good deeds. In this period of time, study of Torah had become of great value and of great importance because the rabbis had replaced the Kohanim. When the temple stood, the Kohanim, one of their roles was to be teachers. Once the temple was destroyed, the Kohanim lost their role. So the rabbis had to replace the role. Moreover, during a large period of this time, the Romans of Torah. So that made the importance of studying Torah all the more important because you could lose all of your leadership, and so you still need to keep transmitting the Torah. And the new version of Judaism, which they were developing, was new, so it had to be disseminated widely. So many people were engaged in the study of Torah. At the same time, it was also important to scholars that they had to earn a living and that they could not ignore the needs of the others in their community. So there are many Mishnayot, as we'll see next time, which discuss what's the balance between this. Should one study Torah all the time? Should one have a profession and study Torah only at night, the way Maimonides did 1,000 years later? It was also important for Torah scholars to avoid exaggerating their importance. As a result, the topics of honor and humility appear frequently in Pirkei Avot. Theme chapter deals with those topics. As I said, our second session in 2 weeks will focus on most of these theme chapters. Our third session, in 5 weeks, I think, will focus on the content theme chapter, which deals with the ethics in Ethics of the Fathers. Every Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is an ethical teaching, but many do have ethical content. While proceeding through the book, I highlighted the ethical principles that I found and then brought them together and organized them thematically in a separate chapter. I also did what they didn't do in Pirkei Avot, and that is to turn each of the ethical principles that were there into directive statements. How should the person behave? Now, people may fault me for that, but I felt that was very important because giving ethical statements like, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me, giving just those in broad terms, people what they need to do. So, let's see, what time is it now? Do we have time to break up into groups again? Yes, it's 10. Okay, so I'm going to pause my presentation again and ask you to return to your groups and discuss teachings 4, 5, and 6. Those online, I hope, and discuss number 4, 5, and 6. We'll resume in about 10 minutes. Okay, can we get back again? Okay, so let's see. Anyone have any comments on number 4?
Said today,
Excuse me?
said in many languages today, don't judge a man till you walk a mile in his mile.
That's right. So it's a very common saying. Anyone have anything? Yes.
Word for empathy.
Empathy. So I don't think they had a word for empathy. Many situations where it's clear that they did not have words that we have to express a variety of things. And had they had, so that would be here perhaps. Perhaps this means to empathize with your other person. Any comments about number 5?
Should I just respond to that?
Oh, sure, please.
One is a positive command and one is a negative one. Don't judge. You know, it may be easier than say be empathetic. I think that's really interesting that you put, it's not directive, so.
Okay, so you can imagine them saying to be empathetic, but they only had a negative thing here.
Yeah,
Okay.
at least don't judge.
Okay, don't judge. Okay.
It's interesting, I was, that was said, and I aspire to that all the time. Not assume that I know what's going on the other side, or
Right.
story that I don't know. It's very hard to
Yes.
maintain that mindset that I really don't know what's going on the other side forward.
Right.
And before I decide I do know, let's ask the question.
Is it possible to be in the other person's place?
Couldn't possibly. But brings in their own set of
Right.
history and circumstances.
Everyone sees it from their own perspective. So maybe he's saying you shouldn't be judging at all. Okay. I put that in here particularly because of number 5. So one of the statements in number 5 has the same flavor. Which one has the same flavor?
Not easily become angry. is that-
No,
The honor, what about honor?
that's not what I had in mind. So let me just say it. The last one, do tshuva one day before your death. When is that?
Oh,
So therefore, you have to do tshuva you have to do the right thing every day. You can't say, I'll wait till I'm older and then I'll start doing, then you're gonna become older.
But if you don't do tshuva, are you putting off your death?
Well, I don't think that works. I don't think it works that way. Now, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was one of the 5 major students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he was towards the end of the 1st century. And each of the Yochanan ben Zakkai got to say 3 things in Avot. And so his 3 things are these. One of these is do not easily become angry. One is in part because the person who became the head of the Sanhedrin in around the year 80 the second. Gamliel the second, his father, Shimon ben Gamliel the first, was the head of the Sanhedrin when the Romans conquered Jerusalem, and his father was beheaded. Ben Gamliel was a very angry person. He did a great job of keeping the Jewish people together, securing some safety for them from the Romans at the end of the first century. But he was an angry person, and one of the people he was angry at was Eliezer ben Harkanos. So when Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanos says, "Do not easily become angry," he knows whereof he speaks. And no, as I heard you speaking here, he doesn't say don't become angry at all. I mean, there are times when righteous indignation is appropriate, and there are times when you need to express anger, even if you don't. But it's best if you don't feel angry when you express anger. Like if you're dealing with people on the phone who are reluctant to do what you want them to do. But if you become angry, that's no good. But, so anyways, he talked about, but the first thing he said is very interesting because I think of it as a commentary on the Torah, which says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." You should love your reacha, your other person like yourself. And the question is, what does that mean in the Torah? Rabbi Akiva says that's the most important principle of the Torah, is to love yourself. But what does that mean in practice? Rabbi Akiva was actually a student of this Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanos. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanos says, look, we can't, what does it mean to love everybody? What does that love consist of? And who is that everybody? You can't love everybody, and you can't love everybody in every possible way. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanos' statement here is basically one way of interpreting that. It says, well, at least for people who are your chaver, you should their back. You shouldn't let people say things about them. You should treat anything said about her as if it were said about you, and you should object to people saying negative things about your chaver. Another one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, let the financial dealings of your chaver be as important to you, using exactly the same words that Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanos is saying. So you can imagine them sitting together and discussing, what does it mean? You should love everybody like yourself. And so one says, well, one way in which you can do that is to make sure their reputation is not diminished in any way, just as you wouldn't let your reputation be diminished. And the other one says you shouldn't let their financial circumstances be diminished in any way, just like you wouldn't let your circumstances be diminished. And so they narrow the interpretation of loving to those two examples, and they narrow the interpretation of everybody, your other people, to those who you are close to.
Interesting that the narrowing excluded family.
Interesting. Okay, I in fact, the word in number 4 and number 5, the word fellow is chaver. So that is interesting. I don't know what to say about that. I think they saw it, and this is of course one of the defects, is they saw it only in terms of the interaction between men. And so they didn't talk too much about interactions with women and children. They weren't important from a Torah perspective, from a halacha perspective.
But it also excludes father and son relationship.
Yes, but the Torah is very explicit that you should honor your parents and you should obey your parents and so on. So that has its own verse. Okay, let me, we have only a few minutes left, so let me wind up a few more things I wanted to say. Okay, Before I contemplated writing a book on Pirkei Avot, I studied Maimonides' commentary on Avot, and in some ways my book is a commentary on Maimonides. Maimonides tries to make a synthesis between Judaism and Aristotle. He has criticized the ancients, whether the ancient sages or the ancient Greeks. However, when he disagrees with what they say, he states his own view somewhere else. So it is not presented as a direct criticism of his teacher. So I may be wise. For example, he does not challenge the idea presented in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot that the oral Torah is precisely what was given by God to Moshe at Sinai and passed generation to generation. So if you think about it, I mean, everyone, when I speak about this, someone often says, well, what about the telephone game? How can you passage on passing something word for word from generation to generation? After 3 or 4 times, it's going to be changed somehow. So about because he says elsewhere that the oral Torah is developed over time. Although he doesn't say this explicitly, he seems to be denying that the oral Torah is precisely what God said to Moses. My book at times is critical of Maimonides and at times of the text itself. Here's an important example. The Sadducees were the keepers of the temple, and they were the Jewish people. They were called Sadukim in Hebrew because they were descendants of Tzadok, who was the first high priest in the first temple in the 6th century before the Common Era. No, earlier than that. Sadducees is the anglicized version of Sadukim. The Pharisees were an upstart group. In Hebrew, Perushim means those who separate themselves. The first chapter of Avot presents a revisionist view of history, that the Pharisees were the keepers of the oral Torah for 1,000 years, and the Sadducees were the upstarts, not the other way around. And so that's stated explicitly here in Pirkei Avot, and Maimonides buys into that. Chapter 1 of Avot is an example of the victors rewriting history from their own perspective, since once the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees essentially faded from the playing field. Let me see if there's time. No, not enough time. Okay, I give another example, but I'm not going to do that. So let me summarize. My book looks not just at individual Mishnayot, but also looks at the big picture. A broader view and looks at collections of Mishnayot that deal with a shared topic, both in the individual Mishnayot and in separate theme chapters that deal with common topics. It provides some of the historical context in which the sages lived and reflects the context in which I was writing. Many of the teachings played out in my life. It compiles and organizes the ethical principles in Pirkei Avot and presents them as imperative statements. And it provides a critique as well as a commentary on Pirkei Avot in an informal conversational style. So, as some people have said, it reads like a dialogue between me and you. Many of you here this morning and online have already purchased a copy of my book. If you don't already have a copy, you can get a copy this morning. It's right here. You can also purchase it on my website, which is joerosenstein.com. And I invite all of you to go visit my website because it contains many of my other writings. We have time for maybe another comment or two, or question or two. Anyone online have a question? No. Okay, you have a question. Yes, comment.
This about Rabbi Ben Zakkai being carried out in a coffin.
Yes.
And being confronted by Vespasian, and then he gives the prophecy, and it turns out to be true, and he's rewarded. I read that just told the same story about himself, not the coffin part, but that when he was captured by the Romans, he had been a general. He was captured by the Romans. He was brought before Vespasian because he was also general, and he said that the Jewish texts prophesied that he, Vespasian, would become emperor. And he was then warned by Vespasian, the story. So,
Okay,
so I'm wondering, one of them lifted the story from the other.
well, I don't think, I could be, I don't know.
They borrowed, but they don't wanna-
Maybe they, idea.
Yeah. Vespasian, maybe it became known that Vespasian was a sucker for that story.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that may be. This was the year Vespasian became emperor in 69, I think it was. And 4 emperors, Vespasian being the last of the 4. So evidently there was some instability and it may have been, as you said, that he was the most likely candidate because he was most highly regarded.
There are
Yeah.
a lot of- there are a lot that echo stories in the Talmud. Different miraculous or supernatural aspect that they have in the Talmud.
I see. Okay. Okay, so today, I hope you're able to come in 2 weeks. What we'll do next time is make the people who are on a group which will be here, virtually here, but hopefully it'll work better for you next time. Okay, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in 2 weeks, I hope.